Welcome in from your SUV, from your tractor or your ute, or maybe you're even riding your electric motorbike. But from wherever you are, you're with Alistair Moorhead and Glenn Judson, and this is the Juddy Show. Well, what we want to do is reach out and provide you some technical information on a range of agricultural topics which may interest you, but to do it in a different way. Casual and comfortable format that allows you to listen where you want and when you want. This is intended for general information, and for more specific advice, contact your local Agricom rep. Well, Alistair, you're looking a bit mischievous over there. Good to see you. What are we going to learn about in today's podcast?
Well, Glenn, we're going to take a trip down the history of our Marshdale research site, and its subject title really is Marshdale, Science Amongst the Stones. So I might hand it over to you to describe us what all that means.
Oh, well, thanks. Probably the best thing we could do is describe actually what Marshdale is physically. And so Agricom has this 68 hectare property, which is in free draining soil, that we're able to, so it's set up into farmlets. And what this allows us to do is compare some of our new products, some different grazing managements, to see, to look at differences between those. And I guess at a very high level, it serves a couple of purposes for the Agricom group. A lot of our new products, when they come out, we see them through the plots and we measure the amount of dry matter that's being produced from those, and we look at disease scores and a lot of other attributes. Absolutely. So the agronomic attributes of those plants. But when we can get them into a slightly larger system where they're in a farmlet and we've got cattle, whether that be beef cattle or young dairy stock going across those, we can learn a whole lot more about how they actually will perform on farm. And that's what this property allows us to do. It's set up into little farmlets where we can measure the productivity of the grass itself, but also the animals on it, and look at the relative strengths in terms of times of year or relative to other products. And it gives us a really good idea of some of those new products coming through. The other thing it does is sometimes we take products that we've known before there, but what we do is we look at how we can use those differently. So we get how do we use an old product in a different way that gives us a greater performance. So it gives us a chance to play some things. What happens if we did this? What happens if, and one that comes to mind is, what happens if we let cocksfoot build up large covers, 7 tons, and then we graze that with animals? And so it gives us the ability to play in a controlled environment to work out what if.
And measure. Yeah. So the key here is that everything's measured as we go along. So there's sort of no escape from be it the management interactions or the species interactions. There's no real escape. So let's break this down a little bit further just so we can carry on and describe the farm. First of all, it's about 300 metres above sea level, about a natural rainfall of about 850 mils.
Yep.
It's a stony silt loam.
Yeah, very stony. And I think you picked up the science amongst the stones. It is quite a stony property, and that brings...
No one puts their hand up to do soil related stuff at Marshdale because you have to find the soil between the stones.
Yes. Soil testing for our nutrient strategy is very testing because there's lots of stones there. But and of course that brings quite a low soil moisture holding capacity, which brings some real issues in terms of the management of that particular site. It is irrigated, but we don't always get access to irrigation. It runs off a river. When flows are low, we don't get to irrigate, and therefore for periods of time it can come under some significant moisture pressure, which is what makes this really good. Is it's a real farming situation.
And I would comment there is that, when I've got products that I select and we test, our breeders create, I select them and then we test them. And one of the things I value consistently the most is I want products that can tolerate a large array of management issues. And Marshdale defines that very clearly. It can go from being heavily stocked but with resilient free draining soil to bone dry and you've still got cattle on your land. So you're still actually feeding out to low residuals in a heartbeat. And so the reality is the range of intensities that can occur there are really attractive to me because it really tests our products out between, growthy, almost dairy-like conditions to almost semi-arid, browned off landscapes where you're still trying to feed cattle on the very same products that were there growing like dairy pasture.
Yeah, and I guess that's the other really important point here is that we've got skin in the game, right? And we are facing, essentially running this, we are facing the very same challenges that our farmer clients are facing. And therefore, it's really good to keep us grounded in the fact that, if we're going to say that you can do something, this gives us the chance to go and do it and actually prove that it can be done. And it does keep our feet pretty closely on the ground. Another really good example is, we have a strategy around bloat, for example, and it's not necessarily what's in the textbook, but it's what's worked for us. And I guess that's the other thing is we do get hands-on opportunities to test some of these things out.
So how long ago did we start the project, Juddy?
Well, Marshdale's really been there or thereabouts, probably far back as 2010, 2011. And we started doing a little bit of work on the site. And it was actually an old sheep farm at that stage. And we started doing some work in that. And what we've done is we've gradually taken a little bit more land every year to do some of that work on it. And at one point, we took ownership of the property under a lease, long-term lease, and all of the animals on that property are now, we own those, and so we are essentially running a small commercial farm. But I think the benefit is not necessarily just the commercial income from that, but it's the learnings, the ability to demonstrate to others some of these new products. And Agricom certainly do use that as a shop window, with a number of groups, visitors in the hundreds coming to visit that property and listen and learn and share some of the experiences, in a range of different projects.
Just describe the animal systems for us that you're actually running there at the moment.
Yeah, at the moment. So at a high level, what we're doing is we're taking in 100-kilogram wean calves, and these can be either out of the dairy industry because that's an important source of animal coming from there. They'll always be there. Sometimes we take beef animals as well. They tend to be at a heavier weight at weaning, but essentially we're taking those 100-kilogram calves and we're trying to take them somewhere through to in the vicinity of 550 to 600 kilograms, and that happens within 3 years, sometimes faster. Sometimes some of the bottom end animals will take that long to get through there, and then they're being processed, going to slaughter. That's the system that we're running. It's 100 kilograms through to 550, 600 kilograms.
Technically, that's 2 winters.
Yeah,
on average.
On average, it's 2 winters. We can do this inside with only wintering them once, but we tend to find that the target weights must be a little lower, and you've really got to be hitting growth rates for every day of the year. And when we do run into some of these issues around summertime, free draining soils, pastures burning off, that can be quite a challenge.
And just another context around our location, technically the economic schedule for the beef industry is pretty heavily weighted to the spring and not the autumn.
Correct.
So your value proposition is a little bit stronger, taking them through to the spring, through a second winter.
Yeah, it just means that, maybe those margins, when you take into account, you've got to winter them twice. The most efficient way is to winter them once, but in some of these situations, wintering them twice is actually a necessity for at least some of those animals coming through. So that's at the high level. If you kind of dig down a little bit, essentially we're in farmlets. So animals will be assigned to a farmlet for the spring, summer, and autumn, and then come together as one group to be held or grown over the winter, typically on a kale or a fodder beet crop, and then return to those individual farmlets. So we are comparing farmlets, not replicated, but we are comparing farmlets over time and looking at the relative production on a per hectare basis. So the kilograms of meat produced per hectare.
Yeah, and to be fair, we often use the word farmlets and or systems, but the reality is they're on a feed type for 9 months of the year, and they're measured every 2 weeks for the 9 months that they're on that feed type. So these blocks of land are in a common feed type, and they get access to no other feed inside that time frame. Or the key measurement group of animals are.
Yeah, so I think just to give listeners a little bit more of a mind's eye view of this, one of our first experiments was to look at the production from a very productive tetraploid perennial ryegrass. Again, animals grazing around that for those 3 months, 3 seasons of the year. Yeah, and we compared that with similar animals, but they were grazing a cocksfoot. And you would have thought at the start of the experiment that there was a huge difference in terms of the production, both as the speed at which animals grow, but also the carrying capacity between those two.
And I'll explain, just to digress a tiny bit to explain how we actually got to that concept of even comparing a tetraploid perennial ryegrass to a cocksfoot for live weight gain. And that's because there's been very little work done on cattle, full stop, in New Zealand from a live weight perspective. And maybe that's just been filled in recent years. But up until the 2010s, there was very little industry information on live weight gain in cattle in New Zealand on different forages. So a lot of the farming community's views on cocksfoot were based on a vast amount of research through the 80s and into the 90s based on summer lamb live weight gain against cocksfoot against other species, from ryegrass through to white clover and chicory and other species like that. So that's lamb live weight gain on cocksfoot in summer drove the industry's awareness about how cocksfoot is not a high quality plant and is hard to grow animals on. However, the one bit of dairy work, and I can't quite remember the exact year it was done in Taranaki, they did, which is in the west coast of the North Island and a very high rainfall, a very ryegrass environment. They compared ryegrass, timothy, white clover, and cocksfoot together for milk production. Now, cocksfoot was the lowest milk solids production out of those treatments, but what caught my eye at the time is that it had the highest body condition score. So although not producing the milk solids, the cows in the cocksfoot treatments had the highest body condition score. And it sort of got my mind working to give you a question of what drives milk production for a dairy animal versus a beef animal and drives live weight gain. The theory has always been high digestibility, high energy. But there's an assumption with beef cattle is that it's always intake driven as well. So as long as you have the intake, you got the animal performance. So suddenly comparing two quite different quality grasses, but in a beef system in a 9-month period is quite unique at that time. And it was quite telling. So you just take us through what you saw.
Yeah. And I think when we went into this, the question we really had was we were expecting animals physically to grow faster on the tetraploid ryegrass because of the perceived quality. But we wondered whether on the cocksfoot we might have carried a higher carrying capacity. And we wanted to know which way, if you multiply those two things together, which produced the most kilograms of live weight per hectare. And so as we went through that, probably one of the things that we learned from this was in a good science experiment, we try and make sure that we control most of the variables. And so what we were essentially doing is we were farming cocksfoot.
Like a ryegrass.
And really, when you look back, you go, if you farm a cocksfoot like a ryegrass, you'll just get what you probably get out of a ryegrass. And that maybe we need some different management.
When it came to volume. And so we got no extra volume out of the cocksfoot because we're actually running a rotation design for ryegrass.
For ryegrass. And therefore, the ryegrass was very good because we were running under a ryegrass regime.
So in saying that, it was very good, but the actual per head performance wasn't vastly different. In fact, it was only within the tens of grams.
Yeah.
Over 900 to 1.2 kilograms of average live weight. It was only in the tens of grams apart.
Yeah. So the differences weren't as large as we thought, and we recognised that potentially cocksfoot could do better than it was doing if we actually applied a cocksfoot management
or a different management.
And so that did start us thinking about what was the appropriate management for cocksfoot. So you can see unreplicated, but this property gives us the ability to observe those differences and start wondering about some of the other effects that you might get here. So it was very useful.
That particular project sent us off on a couple of other tangents in this property as well, because it was actually due to circumstances alone. We actually got a really poor legume. So this is irrigated and it's fertilised. So cocksfoot can be very hard on clover in a dry land environment. It's a very aggressive plant. It's very tolerant to low fertility situations. But in free draining country, it can really respond to irrigation and fertility as well. And that's what we've shown at Marshdale to a great degree. But in this particular trial, one of the limitations of it right from the start, which was against the cocksfoot treatment, was we never got a good clover establishment in it. We should have got it, but we didn't. It just circumstantially didn't turn up. So the reality with that is this whole live weight gain trial ran for between 4 and 5 years, and all the way through it had a very poor legume content from day one. So what that sent us off on a tangent inside the property was to find other companion species, particularly legumes, in a fertile, irrigated world for cocksfoot. And we've actually learnt quite a lot from that.
We have.
And they were just demos. They were 3 hectare, 1.5 hectare lanes that we put different legumes in amongst it. And actually, for one of the projects we may bring up shortly, it has been converted into another project at year 5. And at year 5, we have still got both red clover and lucerne still present in the cocksfoot paddocks that we sowed afterwards to try and manage how do we keep legume content high in an irrigated, fertilised cocksfoot stand.
And I'd say they're still present. It's probably more than that. They are
exceptional.
They are contributing significant dry matter and probably nitrogen to the system.
Cycle,
in that. And that was, for me.
But that was a direct result of that other project. We were searching for legumes to fit. And in our rotation lengths at Marshdale, which tend to be about 30 days, both lucerne and red clover have excelled in that combination.
Yeah. And I think what we were finding is, and particularly where we were getting these hot, dry summers and the irrigation was turning off, what we were finding is our white clovers weren't being able to persist through that. And so we were looking for alternatives. But in recent years when we have had reliable irrigation, and particularly as we go through wet summers, that white clover has been very useful as well. So again, the decision on which legume to put with your cocksfoot will very much depend on the seasons that you're going through. And I guess what we've said is if there is a risk that you're not getting a lot of white clover through because you're hitting hot temperatures. And just to give you an example, one of those summers we had about 35 days over 30 degrees. And in some of those we had no irrigation. And so you go, that's getting a bit hot for white clover to go through there, particularly with a aggressive grass. But in the same vein, the lucerne in that situation has been quite exceptional. And so I think choosing the legume with cocksfoot is really important. Choosing the right one will come down to what your summers look like and what legumes will take you through some of those challenges.
And in this case, it's our rotation length that we've already embedded in our system. So that was an example of one of your first and interesting ones. If you look across all the different styles of work, you've published papers from Marshdale and related work. Have you got a real your favourite at the moment? Because I've got one, which I'll mention, which is the one we're running at the moment.
Excellent. So I think there was a lot of kale work done there, but I think the one that I probably
quite like your multi-day break.
Yeah, that was
kale work.
Yeah, so that was part of the kale, but I think probably the one that I really enjoyed doing the most, and it was, I've got to say, it wasn't an easy experiment to run, but this was around using kale, but also ecotane baleage. And the benefit of doing it at Marshdale, we could have done this, in small plots, but the scale gave us something that.
So hold on, let's back out of that. What are we talking about? We're talking about winter feed is kale.
Yep.
What's ecotane baleage?
So ecotane baleage. So ecotane is the environmentally functional plantain. And what we were trying to demonstrate is
ecotane baleage?
So baleage is we're conserving that. So it's ensiled.
So what was this off a pure stand, or where did you get this from?
Yeah, so off a pure stand, we were ensiling essentially a seed crop that we had some high covers, and we ensiled that away and put that into a bale, and we were feeding that back to calves to see whether we could retain what we get out of the fresh material, which is a reduction in urinary nitrogen, seeing if that would hold through when we ensiled it. Because it's a bit of a game changer if you can use ensiled product, because it means you can use it anywhere.
You can grow it in one place and use it in another.
Or you can grow it in the spring and use it in the autumn. So it's very useful. So one of the study that we did there in terms of proof of concept is we were able to demonstrate that when we fed young calves kale and ecotane baleage, that we saw a decrease in urinary nitrogen concentration, and we were also able to show that urination frequency went up. So it conformed to what we thought was what actually happens with the fresh product was still actually happening in the baleage. And I think for me that was the ability to do that at scale at a property like that was really
you
exciting.
Published a paper on that. That was in Gore. How many years ago was that now?
I can't remember, but it was actually, now that I recall, we did that over 2 years.
Yeah.
So there's a volume of work there that demonstrates that in both years we were able to get a significant reduction in terms of urinary nitrogen. So that for me was one of the more memorable ones, because we were able to repeat it over 2 years, and we could do that at scale. So what's one of your?
Well, to be fair, I'm biased because it's part of the sort of the idea of this particular bit of work, and the team that we work with you is just awesome, and carrying this particular project out. But it's the Diverse Pasture Project, Juddy, and you should know this because it's what we're living through at the moment at Marshdale. We've got five treatments of multi-species pasture, and it's 5 treatments of diversity.
Yes, so I guess most pastures are diverse.
Well, apparently not, by the way, because there's a lot of opinion about what diverse means to different people.
So what does the diverse mean to you?
Oh, my probably, if I was to sum up a practical diverse in the context of New Zealand pasture, it's what I have been recommending in our publications my whole career. It is potentially a grass, multiple legumes, and a herb, or multiple herbs. And so that would be what I would describe as diverse. The issue we probably have today is that due to the landscape and the availability of different types of seed, you can make diverse as you actually want today. And so we started this project as a bit of a journey in understanding the interactions between soil characteristics, plants, and animal production. And what I love about Marshdale is no matter where you go or what you say or what you believe, we're measuring all the animals every 2 weeks. So technically the animals are having their say in everything that's going on. It's not just humans giving their beliefs about what's going on. It's the animals have a voice in this by their well-being and their performance, their live weight gain. So our management impacts the live weight gain, but in the case of all of these scenarios, the performance is very little, or is limited by intake. So just quickly going to look at the strengths of this particular project is we have 5 treatments, and one of them is a genuinely diverse pasture. I designed it. It was as a well-designed based on the ecology of the plants, their seed size, their establishment speed, their compatibility. And I had a very strong awareness of what they would transition from and to in the end. It was designed to be pasture, established with a small cover crop that provided fibre that's going to encourage a lot of breakdown and activity on the surface. And also that, and so it's a transition from sort of like a summer crop that has a fiber source into a perennial pasture. And that had about 28 species in it. That was paired with the 5 to 6 year old coxfit stand that we described to you earlier, which had the red clover and the lucerne in it. Because I believe that 26 species mixture will revert to coxfit with some chicory, lucerne and red clover in it at a later date, because coxfit is a dominant species in this landscape, ecology-wise. And when you manage anything laxly, coxfit becomes totally dominant. And this is an ecological position for that species over others. So we've got 2 lax treatments. One is a very multi-diverse, or what do we call it, complex diverse pasture. One is an aged pasture that is 5 to 6 years old. What I love about this project is we have a 50-year-old. It was a great decision by yourself and me and tagging along to not cultivate one of the original pastures and maintain it. So we have 3 hectares of a greater than 50-year-old pasture that has been untouched. It's been subdivided and it's had fertilizer on it. So it's conformed to scientific principles of subdivision and fertilizer practice. And its sward has evolved and settled over 50 years, and the soil has been untouched for 50 years. What a great standard for any sort of project like that.
And I guess the thing there is that it takes you 50 years to create that.
You're correct, and you just can't clack your fingers and have a 50-year-old stand that the soil hasn't been disturbed.
Yes.
And this is an ecologically stable pasture that does change based on rainfall and seasonality, and there's a few bits of seed that comes in from the animals, and what's in there reseeds over time. So there's no single plant that's 50 years old. It's just that it's continued. It's a true ecotype, true pasture.
Oh, I'm amazed. It amazes me to think how many generations of grass scrub have actually gone through that, that pasture.
Close to 50.
Yeah.
One a year for 50 years. So yeah, exactly. You've probably got your own genetics there. And then the last 2 treatments are a couple of my favourites, in that they are what we do every day. So they are a fescue pasture, which is both Hummer tall fescue and Oakton meadow fescue pasture with red clover, white clovers, chicory and plantain. So by any description, it's quite diverse. When you see it, it's diverse. We have a ryegrass pasture, which is ryegrass and coxfit, chicory, red clover, plantain, and white clovers. Again, these are not what you describe as complexly diverse, but they are species that are highly functional and are performing to a very high degree in that multi-species complex pasture as well. The difference is the 50-year-old pasture, the fescue diverse, and the ryegrass diverse pastures are all being managed intensively on a 30-day rotation with nitrogen and with phosphate returns at a pretty much an industry standard. What we take off, we're putting back on, and we're aiming to maintain a productive, healthy environment with nutrient use. The lax treatments, we aren't using as much nutrient at this stage. We are allowing the plant biomass to cycle nutrient, and we're watching what that is driving there. What we are seeing, Glenn, from a stocking rate, you might be able to help me here. What are we seeing with the stocking rate and stock flow between those 2, the lax treatments and the 3 intensive fertilised treatments?
Yeah, so essentially stocking rate is, it's the way we work this is that we're looking on how much cover we've got, how much we're growing, and we're stocking that to the appropriate level. So all the time we call this the put and take system, where in the spring we've got lots of feed coming and dry matter production is high. Those stocking rates will be high. We review those every time we weigh. So every 2 weeks we're adjusting to.
So we're targeting residuals for both of these treatments, aren't we?
So operating on a pre-grazing mass in most of these at 3 tonne and coming out at 1,500. So
that's the intensive system.
Intensive system, pretty typical. In the more lax, what we call the lax grazing, we've chosen to get on a longer round, and what we're trying to do is eat half of what's there. So we have less animals, we're running higher covers, and we're putting more of the material that we grow back on the ground. And so that's the 2 philosophies. In terms of stocking rate, the lax system is being run at a much lower stocking rate than the intensive. And it's obvious when you look at how much material that we are leaving on the ground for that recycling. So,
well, we're 1.5 years into a 5-year project.
Yep.
And we've got starting comprehensive soil tests. We're into our second sampling time, which we've had. We're about to do our third.
Yep.
I can say with the organic matters, it's been a really interesting journey already. I think the third point on this journey will be really important, the third measurement, because having 2 points is actually quite, that's really not enough to understand. But what I can highlight is that our lowest soil organic matter in this environment is about 7.8. Our highest is about 12. The 12 is the 50-year-old pasture, and an organic matter of 12 is outstanding, like incredible, actually. What's really validates this sort of measurement for me is the right treatments have the right organic matters based on their age. The 50-year-old touch has the highest. The 6-year-old pasture has the next highest. It's got a 9.6 organic matter at the moment. And the complex lax, the intensive ryegrass diverse, the intensive fescue diverse, all are parallel to each other, sitting and moving from the late 7s into the mid 8s for organic matter. And it's going to be fascinating to get a third point this coming year.
I think one of the other things that this project has actually done, and it's useful to talk about this a little bit, is there's a lot of interest in this, and we do have a lot of people that are coming along to have a look to see what is actually happening. And I guess that's the other thing is there's probably no agendas here. What we're trying to do is understand these systems as well, and if we can bring people on and they can see for themselves and they can make their interpretations, that's useful for everybody. And so really this has become a shop window and a talking point for people who are searching for what else is out there, what do these diverse pastures mean, what are the alternatives, what's the production of those. And so really this is not saying one's right or wrong, it's saying what are the relative benefits of each of those.
Well, I'll tell you what it's actually proven to me already, and it's a really big deal. I think the meat production is about 3 times on the intensive systems versus the lax. So you give up plant material to feed the ground, to feed the plants, to feed the animals, but you give it back up to feed that cycle. It does cost you, and it costs you in meat production, and so you don't make as much meat per hectare. And that's very obvious from these 2 treatments, really hard to find. What actually another really take-home message for me is, as much as you might want to value organic matter, i.e. the 50-year-old untouched pasture, we are putting the same amount of nutrient on that pasture as we are on the new intensive pastures. And that old pasture is not converting that nutrient to meat in anywhere the same level as the new pastures. And so what it really tells me is that there's actually a cost to keeping the soil in a high organic matter state. And the cost is that it's actually bound up with yarrow and brown top and other secondary species that are meaning that when you put valuable nutrient on, you're not getting a full response to that. You're not being able to convert it fully to extra meat production and extra meat production per hectare. So there's a lot of subtle messages, and I can see a mile away, the 50-year-old pasture is going to give us one message alone. For the same amount of nutrient we're putting on that as we are on the new intensive, we are literally not converting it to any sort of productivity compared to that, converting the ground to a new pasture and farming that pasture well for 5 years. The 50-year-old pasture may have a high organic matter, but it's actually not producing as much nutritious feed to feed animals at a higher rate.
Yeah, and I think you've made this point before. I'm going to make it again. The backbone of all of this is these are probably the most measured cattle in New Zealand. They're in over the scales every fortnight, and we're we're revisiting those allocations on a fortnightly basis. So they are the indicators of what's happening.
And that's what
in
your
the
team does amazingly well. They're out there really nailing that. And what I appreciate about Marshdale, to be quite honest, is that literally there's nowhere to hide. We get it wrong. We have parasites, and our live weights crash. It just happens. So this is what I'm excited about this project, is that we can actually like you say, we don't actually have specific agendas in any way here, because we've learned an awful lot about these lax pastures. And to date, there's nothing that's freaking me out personally, because it's all conforming. Like even the botanical change, the evolution of that 28 species mix, just inside 1.5 years, it's at a very predictable position right now. I know exactly what's there now. And it is moving towards Coxford extremely fast, which is no surprise whatsoever in the system. But the reality is it's been a really exciting journey to watch that happen. And we are learning a lot as we go. And the part I still love about it is there's just nowhere to hide. You're still getting measured. Yep. So you can say what you like, but the reality is we've got this experience that is being measured at the same time.
And I'm sure, as we move from that experiment to others, again, the site gives us the ability to look at those hunches, run that work, understand more about some of the new trends, new questions, particularly around forage, but also in some of our animal work. So it's certainly something that I know we both value in terms of a resource that we've got. The one project that I have fond memories of, because this is a classic animals person doing a project, which is actually an excellent project, and that was I'd like you to describe it, and then I'll just shoot you down over this one agronomic thing. It's the whole use of protein with fodder beet, with different aged animals, 2 fodder beets, 2 protein supplements. I'll get you to explain it, and then exactly, particularly the supplement, and then I'll explain what a disaster that was. I don't know what's coming here, ladies and gentlemen, but let's humour Alistair. So really, this was an experiment around taking fodder beet and some different supplements, and what we were trying to do,
2 classes of animals,
too. 2 classes of animals. But what we were trying to do is set up a situation where we had a fodder beet where we were trying to meet the protein needs of the animal. So that was trying to get as much leaf on our fodder beet as we possibly could, and add a supplement that was high in protein.
Just a clarification here, the key to fodder beet is that in its winter state, it probably has a crude protein in total, that's bulb plus leaf, sitting between 10% and 12%. And that is at the very lowest end of what an animal diet really needs to be,
particularly for young growing animals. And so the other flip side is we were trying to set up a situation where we didn't have quite as much leaf, and we had a poor quality supplement, which was low in protein. So we're trying to set up a high protein and a low protein.
Which just happened to be roadside hay.
Oh, listen, we found some hay that had been made a few years before off the roadside. So unfertilized, it was perfect for this experiment, Alistair.
We'll see.
And so what actually happened here was, and we were 2 classes of animal. And the 2 classes of animal were really interesting because one was young animals in their first winter. And so these animals have actually quite a high protein requirement as they're laying down lean tissue into their bodies. So their requirement for protein is actually quite high. And then the other stock class we had in here was older animals, 2 years plus, where the requirement for protein is not nearly as high. So that 10 and 12 will do them very well. Thank you very much. So we were setting up that experiment to see whether we could pick up differences in terms of whole winter growth based on those 2 protein supplements.
So high quality silage with a protein probably of around 17 to 18 crude protein.
Maybe mid-teens, so yep.
And quite probably a matching 10% crude protein off the roadside straw.
I'd be pretty happy if it was 10. I suspect protein levels could have been single figures, but let's go with that. So what do we learn from that? What we learned from that was with our older animals that didn't require a lot of protein, actually when we were trying to add some high quality protein into their diet. When we were adding the poor quality material in, we actually got some really fast growth rates, and that wasn't because the quality of that poor quality supplement was helping. What actually was doing is they were using it as bedding, and because we'd put that poor quality supplement in, they actually ate more fodder beet, and therefore their growth rate was higher. almost the opposite was the case for the young animals. The young animals where we had them on poor quality supplement, their growth rate really suffered because of the protein content wasn't necessarily there.
Yeah, it was good work, but it was a little bit more detail that was quite relevant in that. I remember it quite clearly. All the animals were tracking equally for each of their paired groups right up until 60 days. So if you'd stop this trial at the start of at the end of the second month of winter, if you'd stopped this trial at that point, you would have said protein means nothing for feeding animals on kale. But to the day almost, those arising 1-year-old animals absolutely stopped in their tracks at about 60 days onwards. And there, the gap between the high protein supplement and the low protein supplement for rising R1s after 60 days was so dramatic that within 30 days, the gap was huge.
So you're right. There was a difference between those, and that difference did show up at about 59 and a half days.
Because you're sitting there going, there's no difference. Yes. You can feed them anything and fodder beet will grow your animals. Yeah. But as soon as you hit 60 days, the world changed.
Yeah. So I think so there's a really important lesson there is that these short-term bits of work, you need to get those in context because things could be happening on a larger time scale. So,
or it could be accumulative, and it's not until it's a macro event it could be subclinical protein deficiency, and then it's not until it becomes clinical does the animal start to tail away.
So again, really good example of where we have sought to understand some of those things that are faced on farm. The question, what supplement should I be feeding to what class of animal, and what's my expectation around that? That it helps us get our mind around what we should be expecting.
So for you agronomists that may be listening here, the absolute takedown moment here is that I hope you recognise that weed-infested roadside hay that became part of our feeding system turned into bedding. And the key to that bedding covered the farmlet that was part of, which meant that the weed burdens we experienced in that rotation after that were extreme. We had yarrow, we had Californian thistles, you name it, we had it coming up. High endophytes, standard endophyte ryegrass seed entering our landscape. So the consequences of bringing a hay-type species into your feed system and your animal's not actually consuming it and using it as a bedding means that the vast amount of those seeds and weed seeds, particularly the bad ones, are entering your rotation, and you may never think about that.
Yeah, and do you know what? I reckon we did a better job than we could have done direct drilling.
Yeah, it's not great. It was really not great at all, and we're still seeing a few legacy moments of that, with particularly thistles and yarrow.
So that's a cautionary tale.
Yes,
about
a consequence,
a natural consequence.
Yeah.
So, Alistair, going to give you this hard job again.
Oh, really?
Yep. Can you summarise for our listeners maybe one or two key things from the conversation we've had around science amongst the stone from our Marshdale farm? What are your take homes? What's the summary that you'd like to present?
It's a really tricky question with this type of discussion because we've just dealt with a bit of a journey of our experience on this property. But what I would say is I'm very, very proud of the efforts our team has made and the investment our company has made in, committing to where the rubber hits the road is what you describe a lot, our skin in the game. When we get it wrong with animals, they're our animals. When our plants don't live up to our expectations, they're our plants and they're our animals. And we experience all this together with us, which is what so many of our clients face in the industry when they're using our genetics. So I'm very, very proud of what Marshdale represents to our business and our investment in the industry. I personally believe Marshdale represents a really important asset for the beef industry because up until Marshdale, and as you know now, it dates back actually prior to the 2010s, there's very little true beef industry information in New Zealand regarding live weight gain on different species. And we have the most extensive live weight gain records that you could possibly imagine across different species. And probably, to be fair, that deserves a paper in the future probably of just actual live weight gain over pretty much closing in on 12 to 15 years worth of research on beef animals. And when you consider there's outside individual farms reporting, possibly at a stud level, very, very few people would measure on a 2-weekly basis for 9 months of the year. And I really take my hat off to your team achieving that. I love the fact that we can do different things. That wee experiment you mentioned regarding the coxfit being taken as a traditional standing hay type or a standing hay shed type concept actually worked a treat, and it was quite impressive just how fast that recovered and became a functional pasture again. And, you know, the Savvy Coxfit that we did that with is an exceptional variety for actually doing that. It doesn't carry a lot of seed head, and it moves from carrying these very high covers to returning to a really nice pasture exceptionally fast. And, you know, that was a demonstration we might need to do again sometime because it was quite impressive, and generationally we forget we've done that. I do think there's been some iconic projects. The actual protein on beef, beet one was actually a big deal, and I think that was a very good industry project that represented a lot of what people saw with live weight gain in the industry, and it made a lot of sense. I do like your multi-day break work on kale. I've really enjoyed this project called the Diverse Pasture Project that the team is running at the moment, and I feel it has given us a lot of educational opportunity, and I just can't wait for 5. No one wants 5 years to disappear, but I'm really looking forward to every new year's worth of data we get out of that. And as I say, it's going to give some great messages. So all in all, it's an asset that I'm very, very proud our company has invested in, and really appreciate actually your staff's efforts there as well.
Well, Alistair, it's getting pretty close to Christmas. It's been a great year. I know there's some more podcasts to come, but hope you have a great break. Merry Christmas to you.
And Merry Christmas to you too, Juddy.